Tonight on KQED Newsroom. With the New Hampshire primary out of the way, the Democratic presidential candidates stump for votes in other key states that could help one of them clinch the nomination. Plus, a new memoir about working in Silicon Valley. We'll talk to the author about the hype and reality of startup culture. And why not skip the champagne and chocolates this Valentine's Day? We'll hear from food experts about fun alternatives to savor with your Valentine. Good evening and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Marisa Lagos. We begin tonight with the state of the Democratic presidential race. This week, Senator Bernie Sanders was declared the winner in the New Hampshire primary, narrowly edging out former South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Senator Amy Klobuchar finished third, riding a resurgent wave of support after a strong debate performance last week. Fellow moderate Joe Biden support has slipped, and progressive Senator Elizabeth Warren's campaign is also facing trouble after a poor showing in New Hampshire and Iowa. Candidates are now turning their attention to South Carolina and Nevada, states with large numbers of Black and Latino voters, unlike Iowa and New Hampshire. Meanwhile, former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg decided to skip the early nominating states and pour hundreds of millions of dollars on ad buys in California and other states key to winning the nomination. Here to discuss this are Paul Mitchell, the vice president of the bipartisan voted data company Political Data, Inc. And joining us by Skype from Las Vegas is the Nevada Independent lead 2020 election reporter, Megan Meserly. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us.
So Megan, let's start with you. It's been very busy out there in Nevada. We are a little more than a week away from the Nevada caucuses, although some people, I think, start voting this weekend. What's the energy like? How does it feel?
Yeah, I mean, people are excited, I think, obviously, to get to participate in this process. Nevada is the first diverse early state to participate in the process. Our population is 30% Latino, 10% Asian American and Pacific Islander, 10% Black. And I think folks are really excited to see how the candidates do amongst an actually diverse population. On the other hand, folks are a little nervous given what happened in Iowa because we have a caucus as well here in Nevada. We were planning to use 2 apps for the caucus process. Obviously, that did not go so well in Iowa, so folks are a little nervous about how that's going to play out.
You talked to me about that. I know we heard this week that there's some sort of moving around by the Democratic Party in terms of how they actually want to do the technology because of concerns. Has that all sort of been set at this point?
We found out a little bit more about what the process is going to be like. So this week, Nevada Democrats released the details of how both early voting and the caucus day process are going to work, given that both were going to rely on the use of apps. They've switched, instead of using an iPad app for early voting, they'll now be having scannable paper ballots, kind of like a Scantron. So they're switching to a little bit more analog of a method, though those ballots will be scanned into a system and that data will be stored on a cloud and then transmitted to people's home precincts on caucus day. That's the interesting thing about early voting we have here. You cast your votes early, but your preferences actually go back to your home precinct to be counted just as if you had been there in person on caucus day. And Democrats are going to be using a Google form-based calculator on a party-purchased iPad to flow that data back to home precincts on caucus day.
Paul, you're like a numbers person. I know you're not like an expert in these apps, but does that all sound reasonable?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, in California, this is completely foreign to us. We have elections that are run by the state, by people who are election administrators who do this year-round, local elections, big statewide elections, and they're very well suited to dealing with this process. It kind of, to me, as somebody who came up in California elections, it's almost laughable that a state party is running a caucus in Iowa that's this important. And that it's not the actual state doing it. So it's very different for us.
Yeah. Paul, sticking with you for a second, 15 million Californians already have their ballots. As you know, our official primary is until March 3rd. Do you think what happens in Nevada and then South Carolina is going to impact people, or will so many people have already voted that it may not make that big of a difference?
Yeah, so first off, to put it in context, that's 15 million out of the state's 20 million. So 3/4 of our registered voters are now in systems where they're either asking to be vote by mail or they're in counties that are switching to essentially a vote-by-mail system where they can vote in vote centers if they need to. What this really means is it adds this time function to California elections, where right now we see over 650,000 people have cast their ballots. By Monday, Tuesday of next week, it'll probably be over 1 million. And that population of voters isn't going to be influenced by what happens in Nevada or South Carolina. And our projections are that by the time Nevada happens, 1/4 of California's total electorate will have already cast their ballots, and by the time South Carolina happens, we may be 40 to 45% of all California voters in the primary will have cast their ballots. So if your goal as a presidential candidate is to win South Carolina and dive into California on Election Day, that pool's going to be half empty. A little low on water.
Yeah, no, not as comfortable. Well, Megan, let's go back to you because, of course, that's not all of the voters who will be casting votes in California. There will be people like me who wait until the last minute to fill out their absentee ballot. I saw that a new poll came out today. It showed Bernie Sanders in the lead, followed by Biden, then Warren. How does that line up with what you're hearing out there? And I mean, obviously, understanding that it's fluid, but do you think that what happened in Iowa and New Hampshire is impacting those numbers at this point?
Yeah, it definitely does have an impact. You know, we'd like to say that Nevadans, you know, are totally uninfluenced by anyone else's decisions. But to tell the truth, you know, the momentum coming out of Iowa and New Hampshire does matter and will make a difference on the race here. You know, we are seeing support for Bernie Sanders. We were seeing it before Iowa and New Hampshire. He was already sort of neck and neck with Joe Biden in the polls. He has, you know, the strongest organization out here, 250 plus staffers. That's much bigger than the other teams. Joe Biden's going to have 130 staffers on here by the end of the week. Pete Buttigieg's team is about 100. So he just has a massive presence, and that's going to be a huge boost to him here, obviously, in the state, coming off those, you know, successes in Iowa and New Hampshire. So it'll be interesting to see, though, how that carries through for some of the other candidates, like Joe Biden, who I think is the one we're keeping a close eye on because he was polling so well here. We know he polls well among voters of color, but how is that going to change after, you know, his performances in Iowa and New Hampshire? And that's something we're keeping a close eye on.
Yeah, and I don't know if it was a disappointment, but I know yesterday you were there when the Culinary Union, which represents some 60,000 workers in Nevada, decided not to endorse anyone. This comes after they had put out a flyer where they kind of seemed to be attacking Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All plan. But in some ways, it seems like the biggest loser out of that non-endorsement might be Biden. Is that fair?
Right. A lot of folks, I think, are reading it that way. Joe Biden, you know, has a long-standing relationship with the Culinary Union. In fact, in that non-endorsement announcement yesterday, the union secretary-treasurer mentioned Joe Biden by name, and he was the only candidate that she mentioned by name, calling him, you know, a good friend of the union. So a lot of folks, I think, were expecting the endorsement, should they, have chosen to endorse, to go that way. So I think folks are viewing it as sort of a leveling of the playing field, especially among candidates that didn't support Medicare for All. The Culinary Union does not like Medicare for All. So it's sort of a leveling of the playing field among those candidates who, you know, support a public option, who the Culinary Union might have presumably endorsed. Now, you know, it's up for grabs and they can court those union members, you know, without any endorsement to worry about.
Do you feel like we hear a lot of stories here in California about an exodus of Californians leaving for states like Utah and Nevada. Any sense that that's changing the feel of the electorate there?
Yeah, I think in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. So one way I think we have seen it is, especially in northern Nevada, influx of folks from the Bay Area to Reno. I think we can see it just in the politics of Reno. It's still considered a pretty purple county where Reno is, Washoe County. But the left in Reno is a little bit lefter than it is in the rest of the state. And I think we're seeing definitely some overlap there, you know, with folks coming for new tech jobs that are opening in northern Nevada. And so there is sort of, I think, a relationship there, a link between Northern California and northern Nevada. So it does have a difference. And obviously, it's just changing the demographics of the state as well. And our population is increasing. So it definitely has an impact.
All right. Well, speaking of a lot of population, Paul, we have a huge population here in California and a huge population of no party preference voters, independents. I'm curious how you think that's going to shape things, especially given the elephant in the room, which is Michael Bloomberg, who is skipping Nevada and all these earlier states to really try to get in this race on Super Tuesday.
Yeah, so it's actually really interesting because, as you know, in California, the Democratic primary is open, meaning that nonpartisans can elect to get a Democratic presidential ballot. But to do so, they need to request it.
Right.
And remember how I said that 3/4 of the state's population is getting a ballot by mail? How does a person who's voting by mail request that Democratic ballot? It's by filling out a postcard that was mailed to them between Thanksgiving and Christmas last year. So a lot of voters, 4.2 million nonpartisan voters who vote by mail got these cards, and a whopping 370,000 of them returned them back.
Really? That's all?
9% return rate.
Wow.
So you have 91% of nonpartisan voters who have been mailed ballots, and when they open those ballots, they're going to have no presidential race at all in their ballot. And so they have to either request a new one or go vote in person to get the right ballot. And that's a huge problem. And we're actually doing a little analysis of some of these voters that are turning in their ballots without having completed the presidential portion. And, you know, it's almost sad to see the reasons they said they weren't able to vote in the presidential primary, even though they wanted to, and a lot of misinformation and confusion. And that could impact a candidate, maybe a Bloomberg or maybe a Sanders, who really did well among this nonpartisan base in 2016. It could really negatively impact their ability to do well in California if they're not able to capture those nonpartisan voters, the fastest growing part of our electorate, simply because of a paperwork thing.
So, Paul, obviously it took a while to figure out Iowa. California is not known for its quick vote counting. When will we have results after Super Tuesday?
Well, we have to kind of bifurcate just those results as they come in. We're going to have the election night results, and that's really the most important win. And then we're going to have the technical winner after 3 weeks or a month of ballot counting.
Of actual delegate.
Yeah,
math.
But what's important is that the election night vote, what you see on Tuesday night, Wednesday morning, it's going to be people who voted early and people who voted in person at the polling place. Ballots that are dropped off in the mail or dropped off at the polling place and need to be verified. A lot of these other ballots are going to take weeks to count. And so really what's most important is who wins that first Tuesday night.
So maybe get your ballot in early. Megan, going back to you, how soon do we think the Nevada caucus results will be public?
Well, we're hoping that we find them out in the span of a couple of hours. The caucus is at noon, so we're hoping we find out, by the afternoon, early evening. But this is a new process, and we've never had this in place before, so I think it remains to be seen. But definitely hoping for results sooner than we got them in Iowa.
All right, Megan Messerly of the Nevada Independent, Paul Mitchell, Political Data Inc. Thank you both so much, and we'll look forward to those results.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
In recent years, tech giants like Facebook and Google have reckoned with massive data breaches and anger over misinformation and disturbing content on their sites. On top of that, there's the culture of Silicon Valley, a male-dominated workplace that often prizes the pursuit of profits over principles of equity and diversity. Now, a new book by Anna Wiener offers an insider's account of life at a startup and the seductive promises of this uncanny valley. Joining me now is author and New Yorker contributing writer Anna Wiener. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So you have said that this book isn't meant to be a polemic or an indictment, and it's not a love letter either. Tell us what it is. What do you hope readers kind of take away from this?
So the book is about my time working at startups, one in New York, two in San Francisco. And my hope is that it reflects my experience here, that it sort of follows a trajectory of disillusionment. It also kind of explains why someone like me might fall really hard for this industry and why it might not be all that it was sort of promised to be. So yeah, I don't want it to be a tell-all or a polemic. That wouldn't be emotionally honest. It's a memoir. For me, it was just emotional truth.
Yeah, you say it's not a tell-all, and I noticed that you kind of go out of your way to protect the names of some of these companies. I assume some of that might be for legal reasons if you work there. But I just wonder what the sort of editorial decision was. Like, why not name Amazon instead of an online book publishing platform or things like that?
So that was a stylistic choice. It is largely because I wanted to emphasize what these companies do. They've become so prevalent. They are considered infrastructure in people's daily lives, but I think that it's important to remember that Facebook is an ad network, and Google is another ad network, and Amazon is a corporation that expresses monopolistic tendencies. And so I think that for what I was writing or am writing about, which is culture, a lot of what I experienced is not specific to any one company. It has to do with the incentives of the business model. It has to do with the norms in Silicon Valley. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to point to a systemic story, a structural story, rather than a strictly individual one.
Yeah. One thing that struck me is the sort of self-created isolation that can exist in this industry. I mean, as an outsider, I've noticed it in the sense that you have these campuses, whether in Silicon Valley or in San Francisco, where you can essentially go there and do everything. You don't have to go out to lunch. You can have your laundry done in some cases, the gym. But then you also talk about your experience being pretty isolated when you first moved here and were working for a startup. I mean, do you think that that is sort of part of the culture? And it seems a little ironic considering companies like Facebook were created to bring us together ostensibly.
Well, I think Facebook's bringing Facebook employees together, certainly. I have never worked for one of those large corporations. I've never had a campus. I've worked in offices in the city, but my experience moving here and working at a 20-person startup that was doing really well and had venture funding, blah, 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 my experience was that it was all-encompassing. And I actually took great pleasure in that as someone who was 25, had moved here without knowing many people. I really liked my coworkers. I enjoyed that blur of social life and professional life, which when you're in your 20s
right.
is perfectly,
totally
can
fine.
be very fun. And then, I think after 6 months, you start to realize that actually that bleed between personal and professional isn't always to the employee's benefit. But for me, it took a little while for that to sink in. I mean, the book is largely a book about work. It can be incredibly seductive for a very young workforce that hasn't had a ton of professional experience.
And is building a life, right?
Yeah.
But do you think that also lends itself to some of the diversity problems we hear? I mean, a lot about obviously racial diversity, but also about gender politics and sort of how hard it can be. And I can imagine as a man or woman, if you get into your 30s and 40s and have a family, that culture can be really limiting.
Absolutely. I mean, I think part of the story that Silicon Valley has told about itself over the years is that it's different, right? That this is an industry that's doing things differently. It's sort of irreverent. It's iconoclastic. It's run on the confidence of an experience. When you have industries that or companies that have no rules or have a lack of lack of processes or a lack of structure.
Yeah, there's not that
floods in.
Yeah,
it inherits all of the problems of the outside world, but without any way for people to be accountable.
Yeah.
And so, I guess in terms of racism or sexism, what you end up seeing is the replacement of structure or organization with sort of social relationships or social preferences. And I think that if you look at the industry and you look at who's in leadership in Silicon Valley, for the most part, it's quite homogenous. And this doesn't reflect any sort of technical superiority or business savvy. And I think has more to do with the sort of social dynamics at play.
It strikes me that there's sort of this sense of Silicon Valley exceptionalism that is embedded in the culture. You talk about in the book that research doesn't necessarily support a correlation between productivity and working 24 hours a day. You talk about how nobody talked about the NSA whistleblower when that first broke almost a decade ago. What is it about that? I mean, in an industry that is literally sort of promulgated by data, they're ignoring the data. Is that an irony?
Well, the thing about data is that it's incredibly flexible, right? Data tells a story, and stories can be manipulated. I think that this exceptionalism, this is another narrative, right? It's a highly individualistic narrative. It's, the roots there are libertarian. This is a very Silicon Valley, very flattering to Silicon Valley narrative. I mean, I think that with that strain of individualism, the question is always, who does that serve? To whose benefit? And what inequities does it help cover up or conceal? And so I think that sort of ties into these other questions of diversity and sexism, racism, ageism as well, I think.
Right.
And, I think another unspoken thing about the industry is that, at least in the startup world, it's very hard to take the risk of working for an unknown company that might fail within a few years if you don't have some sort of economic support.
I'm curious, I mean, you joined your first startup in the early 2010s. It's been, the better part of a decade. Have you seen changes in terms of some of the things that you're writing about or the culture?
I think things are changing. I mean, I think that the conversation around diversity in tech and inclusion has gotten tremendously improved since I started. I started in the industry in 2013, and when I was looking for jobs in 2012, the conversation about women in tech was mostly about white women in tech. And I think that has shifted, rather quickly, actually. And my question with this always, though, is, where are the resources going? Who has funding? Who has agency inside of these organizations? For there to be a meaningful shift in tech and the world at large, I think it would mean revisiting the business model. It would mean revisiting who actually is able to relinquish power, who's willing to relinquish power. And I think right now there just aren't incentives for that change in place, so people are doing incredibly hard work.
Anna Wiener, author of Uncanny Valley, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Glasses glistening with airy bubbles of champagne. Decadent desserts decked out in chocolate. Restaurant reservations booked weeks in advance. This Valentine's Day, why not spice things up with a departure from tradition, like making savory dumplings with fillings that appeal to the pickiest of palates, or making pasta with your Valentine from scratch with just flour, water, and a dash of culinary adventure. Joining me now is Sunset Magazine food editor Ellen Fort and Alan Montecillo, the editor of the KQED podcast, The Bay. Thanks to you guys both for coming in.
Thanks for having us.
Good to be here.
So let's start by getting a little personal here. And full disclosure, actually, Valentine's Day is my first date with my husband 20 years ago. But we actually rarely go out because it's such a thing. I'm curious, Alan, let's start with you. Where do you stand on Valentine's Day? Like, is it a Hallmark holiday that's overblown or a good opportunity to connect?
I'm pro Valentine's Day.
Okay.
I think I'm not ashamed to admit that. I think that, like with a lot of things, I more than anything, I like the idea of taking some time to express to the people you love that they matter to you and that you care about them. I definitely, am someone who doesn't feel, or who feels very strongly that you shouldn't feel obligated to do the thing that is expected just because it's happening, to your point of going out and spending huge amounts of money, booking restaurants weeks in advance. If you can find whatever way is best for you to sort of express how you care about someone, that's fine with me.
I know you have some fun past Valentine's Day. What's one maybe quirky one that doesn't fit with tradition?
Well, a few years ago when I was single, I was just on my phone and I saw one of those list articles, and it was something like, it was 18 grilled cheese sandwiches that are better than a boyfriend. It was just a list of it was basically, just pictures of different grilled cheese sandwiches. And so I'm just reading it, and a coworker of mine just walks by. And then I just showed him my phone, hey, this is funny, right? But not really even thinking about Valentine's Day. You're just showing someone something entertaining on your phone. And this friend of mine, he looked at it and he got this look in his eyes like he was a guy in college about to attempt a keg stand or something, where he's like, dude, let's do it. And so we went to the grocery store in the middle of the workday, got all different kinds of cheeses and cured meats and kimchi and all these different fillings, figs. And we gathered a bunch of friends and made grilled cheese sandwiches for Valentine's Day. It was very entertaining and wholesome in hindsight, but it was fun. And it wasn't oh, we're sad and lonely, it's Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
But we just had a good time.
Well, Ellen, I feel like the cliche is usually French or Italian food, a heavy dessert, champagne. Any other ideas for not sort of, those are all really heavy foods too, is the irony, right?
It is a little ironic. It's you don't want to eat a whole bowl of pasta, then you're not really feeling more sleepy maybe than romantic at that point. I think people do that because it feels indulgent and something you might not do every day. So you're sharing something special with somebody. But I think, you don't have to do that. A lot of things that are fun that you could make together. You could make homemade pasta together. You could get together and make dumplings. There's a whole variety of ways you could make dinner together and not just take a nap after.
Right, and I know you have kids too. Those seems like things that if you needed or wanted to, you could include your children in.
Yes, if you want to include your children, dumpling making is really fun. It's actually very easy. Get your fillings, enough, one for each picky person, and then go for it. It's really fun.
Alan, before coming to KQED, you actually produced a podcast called Racist Sandwich, which was about the intersection between food and race. How do you see that juncture when it comes to this holiday in terms of maybe going beyond some of these traditional European food ideas?
Well, it's interesting. I think the way that we think about which foods are fancy is actually really fluid. I think that there may have been a time when Japanese food wasn't considered fancy or indulgent, but now you can go to a really expensive place and shell out huge amounts of money. So, I just think with any of these things, none of these are what we think of as fancy and proper and appropriate for certain things, especially something like Valentine's Day, which it's not it doesn't have it's not rooted in a major world religion like something like Christmas or something like that.
There's no wrong way to do it,
right,
really.
Food can be fancy. It can be, sort of very sort of simple. It's very flexible. You don't have to feel like you have to do something.
Yeah. Ellen, what's your ideal Valentine's Day?
Well, I cook a lot, but it's fun for me when I have an excuse to really go deep on, a really thick ribeye that I sear in a cast iron. That's fun for me. So I usually go that kind of route, get a really good bottle and you can spend the money you would have spent going out on so much more good stuff for your at home. And so I kind of blow it out if I stay home.
I like that. So we talked about dumplings, pasta, any other ideas. But I think for people who are looking at, okay, it's already Valentine's Day, right? But maybe if they want to create a special memory in the next couple of weeks, anything you would suggest to maybe experiment with?
Well, as Ellen pointed out, making something like dumplings could be really fun. I really think anything where you can do something together, but also that is not I guess, culinarily intimidating. You know, maybe if one of you does more cooking at home, something where you can kind of level things out a little bit. So it could be dumplings, it could be pasta, it could be making a simple cake. You know, and something that doesn't take too long, I would say either. Like the worst thing that could happen is if you try and start a project that is too long, and before you know it, you're hungry, and it's like 9:30, and you're not done.
That's worst case scenario. Actually, always get appetizers. I'd say get a cheese plate, get some good cheese.
I like that.
Don't go hungry.
Like make the whole night a sort of a fun opportunity. Well, the other, of course, big part of Valentine's Day are the drinks, right? And we think of champagne, maybe red wine as these traditional ones. Ellen, I know you brought us some wines to talk about and try, perhaps.
Yeah.
So tell us, like, how are these different from champagne, and where, you know?
So the wines I brought are all pet nat, which is short and for pétillant natural, which just means natural sparkling, and it's not champagne, and these are actually all American wines anyway, so they can't be champagne. They have to be from the Champagne region of France to be champagne.
And are these less bubbly than wine? Like
They're not less bubbly, but they have a little bit of a different method. Champagne is fermented twice, and this is one fermentation. And often, since these wines are natural, which means that there's, I need some.
Yeah, definitely.
Which means that there's a different fermentation process with less sulfites and intervention. Often they can be a little more unpredictable, like diddle different, you know, sometimes they can be kind of funky, a different level of effervescence, and they're really fun. And these three are all American, especially this one is a low ABV wine. I actually wrote about in the Current Sunset. That's my one of my faves right now. It's 3.4% alcohol,
so you can, like,
called
drink the whole
Juju.
bottle?
Yeah, you could. I mean,
Theoretically,
you might
go
need
back
to
to work.
It's Valentine's Day, maybe share, but
Okay. I like that idea. All right, well, let's give this a try. Cheers. Thank you for bringing these in. Oh, that's nice. It's like, it's not as sweet as champagne, too.
Yeah, it's dry.
Could that be like a little less of a hangover, too, perhaps?
One can hope. Depends on how much you drink, though. There's no guarantee.
All right. Well, thank you guys both so much for coming in, and happy Valentine's Day.
Cheers. To you. Cheers.
That'll do it for us. As always, you can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Marisa Lagos. Thanks for joining us.